Hey everyone, this is Music Tech Help Guy, and today I'm checking out the Regroover Pro plugin from ACCUSONUS. Regroover essentially allows us to import in stereo rendered audio loops and separate them into their multi-track content. So this is really cool and opens up a whole lot of new possibilities for remixing and recycling loops and separating them into multi-track content and creating new material with those loops rather than using the loop as it is. So I've imported this loop called 80s Backbeat 1. Let's click on this and listen to it as is. So you can see that the native tempo of the loop was 100 BPM, but the tempo of my Logic project is 130 BPM. So one of the things that Regroover does do is it synchronizes the old tempo to the new tempo. So right here, this is showing the original tempo of the loop, but with the sync button on, it's actually synchronizing the tempo of the loop to 130 BPM, the session tempo. So if I hit play here, you'll see that the loop plays back at the tempo of the project. So if I change this, let's say I want to lower it to 115 BPM, you'll see that Regroover's sync light flashes. When we click on this, we're verifying that we want to change the tempo from 130 down to 115. And now when we play it back, it plays back at the slower tempo. So if you unclick this, by the way, this will go back to the native tempo of the loop. So now we're back at 100 BPM. But we want this to synchronize to our session, so I'll make sure that it's in sync. Now, let's listen to each of these layers. Let's hear how Regroover has separated this loop into 4 different layers. So here's layer 1. So that sounds like the front end high frequency transient of the snare drum, kick drum, and the toms. Here's layer 2. That's mostly just the sort of tail end of the snare drum. Let's listen to layer 3. This is mostly low frequencies, the low frequency kick and snare, and some of the low frequencies in the toms. And then layer 4. This is mostly hi-hat with a little bit of snare in there. So this is the way that Regroover breaks up the loops. It breaks them up into their corresponding frequency ranges. But there's some cool things that we can do to further isolate each of these layers. The first thing I want to mention, though, before we do that is don't confuse your DAW's transport controls with Regroover's play pause button or play stop button, whatever you want to call it. If you press spacebar, this will actually play your entire session. If you just press play here, you're just playing back Regroover, kind of the way the Ultrabeat works. So you want to make sure to separate the playback of the plugin from the playback of your session. So when you do playback Regroover, don't press the spacebar unless you want your entire session to play back. Okay, so let's get into how to separate these and isolate these layers a little bit better. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the grid. So I'm going to go up here and click off, and then I'm going to click on this button right here, which enables sort of like an edit mode. Now, what I can do with this is I can double click to create a selection, and then I can click and drag on either end of this to make that selection longer or shorter. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to drag this out. And the reason why I'm making each of these snare hits pretty long is because there's a little bit of reverb in here too that I want to capture. And then this last one we're going to make a little shorter because we don't want it to overlap the toms. Now, to make this snare material come down to layer 2, where the tail end of the snare is, what we have to do is lock out the tracks that we don't want to apply this to. So I'm going to lock out layer 3 and 4, but keep layer 1 and 2 active. So now if I hit split over here, what this will do is it'll move that transient material down to layer 2. So now layer 2 sounds like this. So that each snare drum has that front end attack on it. Now, likewise, layer 3 had some of the low end of the snare in it. So what we're going to do is unlock layer 3. Let's lock out layer 1. And let's double click and just select these areas where we have the snare drum here. Again, this is the low frequencies of the snare drum. And there's one more at the end. And again, we'll have to sort of work around the toms. So we've locked out layer 1 and 4, enabled layer 2 and 3, and we'll hit split. So now we've moved the full range of the snare drum up to layer 2. Great. So now let's move the transients from layer 1 that were the kick drum transients down to the actual kick drum track. And the way we can do that is the same as before. We'll double click, create a range. We'll do that across all of these kick hits. Notice that I'm not deleting these ranges after I make them. And the reason for that is that, by the way, you can do that. If you hold shift, it brings up an eraser tool. You can click on the range and it deletes it. But if you delete these while you're doing this whole editing process, it can start to shift things around that you don't want shifted around. So that's why I'm not clearing these selections. So I'm going to move layer 1 down to layer 3. So I'm going to lock out layer 2 and 4, and we'll hit split over here. And it moves all that down to layer 3. Now, really, the only thing that's left is on layer 3, there's some toms at the end that I want to move up to layer 1. The low frequencies there. So let's select those. And what we'll do is we will lock out layer 2 and 4, hit split, and we move those up. So now that we've got everything separated, I can go through and hold shift and delete all these selections so we don't have to worry about them anymore. So now layer 1 is essentially just a tom track. So it's all silence here with just toms at the end. Layer 2 is just snare. So a little bit of front end snare in there, but it's negligible, so I'm not really going to worry about it. Layer 3 is mostly just kick. Pretty much all kick. And then layer 4 is mostly just hi-hat with a little bit of front end snare in there, but it's not the end of the world. So that's one way you can do this. And if you press play, the pattern will play in your Logic session just like any other loop or any other instrument would. Except I need to make sure that it's not soloed. Now, one thing that you can do with each of these layers is if I go and select layer 1 up here, and you can see which layer is selected by looking at the green light on the far left here. One thing you can do with each of these layers is you can add effects. So I can add a gate, I can add EQ, compression, and saturation. Let's make these toms maybe a little more gated sounding. If we drag over the top range here and drag this around, we should be able to just play just this area here. And then let's use the EQ and make this quite a bit brighter. Let's go to the saturation unit. Let's pull up the transients and make it a little more transient. Pull up the drive as well. So it's a little tighter now. And then let's pull up the volume right here as well. We'll pull back this playback range. Let's play all of them together. There we go. So we can do the same thing to any of these. Like maybe let's make the snare a little more transient sounding. So again, when you select the track, you can go over to the effects over here. Let's go up to the gate. Let's just play back that one track. Hear how you're hearing a little bit of the kick in there? Let's get rid of that. And then let's also increase the brightness of the snare. There we go. And let's go to the saturation unit, pull up the transients and the drive a bit. So now we've got a little bit tighter snare drum. Let's do the same thing to the kick drum. So we've changed up the effects on our beat as well. Now let's say that I want to take each of these elements and mix them individually within Logic. What you can do is you can actually choose a separate multi-output for each one of these. So I'll choose out 1 for the top one, out 2, out 3, and out 4 for layer 4. So now when we go into Logic here, I can load Regroover as a multi-output instrument. When I go into my mixer now, I can click on this plus button here, and I can create 4 separate Regroover auxes. So when I play this back, each element is separate. Now they're all clipping, so let's pull them down. But basically, the second channel is just the snare. The third channel is just the kick. The fourth channel is just the hi-hat. And then channel 1 was just the tom fill just at the very end. So you could go in, you could individually mix these, pan these, add individual effects to each of them if you wanted to. Now, another way to separate these into their individual layers is to go up to export and say layers. And what this will do is you can save these wherever you want. I'll just save them right on the desktop here. And what it'll do is it'll save these as 4 separate audio files. If I just go to the Finder desktop, you'll see all 4 layers here now. So the first one is layer 1. That should just be the toms. Layer 2. Layer 2 is just the snare. Layer 3 is the kick. And layer 4 is the hi-hat. So you could drag those into your Logic session and work with them as audio if you'd like to as well. Now, another thing you can do is you can turn off your edit mode here, and you can actually drag each of these samples into an expansion kit and trigger them with your MIDI keyboard or trigger them with a sequence. So after you turn off the edit mode, you can double click and create a selection. So let's select this snare drum here. The front end of it doesn't have to be perfect yet. And what you do is you drag over the bottom half of it here. You see this little sort of audio icon on it. You can click and drag this down to a note on your expansion kit. So let's put this snare on C4. Let's grab the kick here. We'll pull that over to D4. And then we can grab a hi-hat as well here. Let's grab one of these other ones. There we go. We'll move that over to, we'll say G4. So C4, D4, and G4. I can play them from here. Or I can play them on my MIDI controller. So you can trigger them with your MIDI controller as well. Now, in addition to that, if you click on the editor here, you can click on each of these individual samples that we just loaded in, and we can select the in and out point of each sample to trim them better. So let's get the front ends all trimmed up so that there isn't a lag between the time we press the key and when we actually hear the note. Let's give that a shot. So another thing you can do is you can reverse the samples. So let's switch up our in and out point here. Let's see what that sounds like. So what we could do is we could either create a brand new pattern with these samples, or we can enhance the current pattern that we have. Now, so far, every time I press spacebar in my Logic session, Regroover will just play on its own, and that's because this host button is on. If you turn this off, Regroover will not play by itself unless you trigger it with MIDI data like I have in my MIDI editor here. So I'm going to hit Command-A, hit Control-M to mute this real quick just to demonstrate. I'll hit spacebar, and you hear nothing. If I turn the host on, you hear it play. So let's turn that off, and you'll notice that we have some notes up here, and we have some notes down here. Now, these notes on the bottom here represent the 4 MIDI notes that represent the 4 layers of Regroover. We have C3, C#3, D3, and D#3. So those 4 notes are those same 4 notes. So if we unmute those and have host off, it will only trigger the pattern when a MIDI note exists for each of those 4 layers. For example, if I were to just mute the snare layer, we wouldn't hear the snare layer. So since we have all 4 of these notes in here, these are triggering the loop to play. Now, because I built an additional expansion kit off of 3 of the samples here, what you can do is you can enhance the loop even more. So let's pull in these notes as well, and let's see what it sounds like now. And there we go. So again, you can build your own loop by creating an expansion kit, or you can enhance the loop that's already there. All right, guys, so that's pretty much it. That is the Regroover plugin from ACCUSONUS. It's an incredible tool for beat building and making loops your own thing. I mean, one of the problems I always find with loops is that when you drag and drop a loop in, it just sounds stock. If you're able to actually break that loop up into its fundamental elements and sort of recycle it and move it around and extrapolate the samples from it and create your own thing out of it, you're not really using the loop as a loop anymore. You're using the loop as source material for your own beat and your own creation. So that's Regroover Pro, really cool plugin. Go check it out at ACCUSONUS.com. Hope you guys enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.